Humble waitress accused of theft by a wealthy customer, but the owner teaches him a lesson. Do you want to know how this incredible story ends? Stick around until the end. You'll be amazed. And don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss our exciting stories. Sarah Mitchell's hands trembled as she balanced 3 plates of steaming food along her forearm, a skill perfected over 6 years of waiting tables at the Golden Fork. The upscale bistro, nestled in downtown Boston's historic district, was her sanctuary, the place where she'd rebuilt her life after losing everything in the recession. Tonight, however, that sanctuary would be tested in ways she never imagined. The evening had started like any other Friday night shift. The restaurant hummed with the gentle clinking of fine china and muted conversations of well-heeled patrons. Soft jazz filtered through hidden speakers, and the warm glow of crystal chandeliers cast elegant shadows across the burgundy walls. Sarah moved through the space with practiced grace, her black uniform pristine, her honey-blonde hair neatly tied back. At table 12, Maxwell Sterling III sat with his usual air of entitled superiority. A hedge fund manager known for his cutting remarks and measly tips, he was a regular that every server dreaded. Tonight, he had brought important clients, a fact he'd mentioned loudly enough for the entire section to hear. His Patek Philippe watch glinted as he gestured dismissively at Sarah, not even looking up as she served their entrees. "The lamb better be perfect this time," he drawled, adjusting his silk tie. "I won't tolerate another disappointment." Sarah maintained her professional smile, even as her chest tightened. "Yes, Mr. Sterling. Chef Thomas prepared it himself." She carefully placed each plate, describing the dishes with practiced precision. The herb-crusted rack of lamb with rosemary juice, accompanied by— "Yes, yes," Sterling interrupted, waving her away like an irritating insect. His guests, a silver-haired couple who'd at least acknowledged her with kind smiles, exchanged uncomfortable glances. As Sarah turned to leave, she heard Sterling's voice drop to a theatrical whisper. "You'll have to excuse the service here. They hire just about anyone these days." The words stung, but Sarah held her head high. She needed this job. Her daughter Emily's college fund wasn't going to fill itself, and the tips from this restaurant were far better than anything she could make elsewhere. At 38, with no college degree and a teenager to support, options were limited. The night progressed smoothly until Sterling's party finished their main course. Sarah approached to clear their plates, noticing Sterling's scowl deepening as he reached for his wallet. Suddenly his face contorted with rage. "My money clip," he bellowed, standing up so abruptly his chair scraped across the hardwood floor. "It's gone!" The restaurant fell silent, dozens of eyes turning toward the commotion. "You!" He jabbed a finger at Sarah. "You were the only one near our table. Where is it?" Sarah's blood ran cold. "Sir, I haven't touched anything except the plates. There was over $2,000 in that clip." Sterling's face had turned an alarming shade of red. "I demand to speak to the owner immediately." Marcus Chen, the Golden Fork's owner and head chef, emerged from the kitchen within moments. His usual warm demeanor was replaced by a careful neutrality as he assessed the situation. At 45, Marcus had built his restaurant from nothing, earning not just a Michelin star, but a reputation for treating both staff and customers with unwavering respect. "Mr. Sterling," Marcus said calmly, "please let's discuss this in my office." "There's nothing to discuss," Sterling spat. "This waitress," he practically spit the word, "has stolen from me, and I want her arrested immediately." Sarah felt the room spinning. Arrest? She couldn't go to jail. What would happen to Emily? The thought of her 16-year-old daughter coming home to an empty house made her stomach lurch. "Sir, I swear I haven't taken anything," she pleaded, her voice cracking. "I would never—" Marcus raised a hand, silencing both of them. His dark eyes held a glint that Sarah had never seen before. "Mr. Sterling, I have state-of-the-art security cameras covering every inch of this restaurant. Shall we review the footage together?" Sterling's expression flickered for just a moment, something between uncertainty and defiance, before he straightened his jacket. "Fine." Let's see it. And when I'm proven right, I expect this thief to be led out in handcuffs. As Marcus led them toward his office, Sarah caught a glimpse of something that made her heart skip a beat. A glint of metal beneath Sterling's chair, partially hidden by the tablecloth's shadow. But before she could speak, Marcus gave her a subtle shake of his head. He had seen it too, and the look in his eyes told her to trust him. What Sarah didn't know was that this moment would set in motion a chain of events that would not only change her life, but would expose secrets that Boston's elite had kept buried for years. As she followed Marcus and Sterling to the office, she couldn't shake the feeling that something much bigger than a missing money clip was about to unfold. Marcus Chen's office was a study in understated elegance, with walls lined with culinary awards and a large security monitor displaying multiple camera feeds. As Sterling strutted in, his expensive loafers clicking against the hardwood floor, Sarah noticed something change in Marcus's demeanor. The usually gentle restaurant owner carried himself with an authority she'd never witnessed before. "Please have a seat." Marcus gestured to the leather chairs facing his desk. Sterling sat rigidly while Sarah perched on the edge of her seat, hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Now, Mr. Sterling, you claim to have lost a money clip containing $2,000, correct?" "Yes, and I know she took it," Sterling snapped, jabbing a finger towards Sarah. "No one else came near enough to—" "That's interesting," Marcus interrupted softly, typing commands into his computer. "Because according to the footage from the last hour," he turned the monitor toward them, showing crystal-clear video of their section. "Sarah hasn't touched anything except plates and glasses. In fact," he zoomed in on Sterling's own movements, "it appears you placed your wallet in your jacket pocket after paying for drinks at the bar earlier." Sterling's face flushed. "The money clip was separate from my wallet. I always keep them separate." "Of course," Marcus nodded, his tone measured. "Then you won't mind if we continue watching?" He fast-forwarded through the footage, and Sarah's heart nearly stopped when she saw what happened next. The video clearly showed Sterling himself dropping the money clip while reaching for his phone, the metal object sliding under his chair unnoticed. "I believe," Marcus said, pausing the video, "we'll find your money clip exactly where you left it, under your chair at table 12. He pressed a button on his desk phone. "Thomas, would you please check under Mr. Sterling's chair and bring what you find to my office?" The silence that followed was deafening. Sterling's face had gone from red to pale, but his eyes burned with a dangerous intensity. "This proves nothing. She could have taken it after—" "Mr. Sterling," Marcus cut in, his voice taking on an edge that made even Sarah shiver. "I've watched you berate my staff for months. I've seen you leave insulting tips after perfect service. I've tolerated it because I believe in professional courtesy, but falsely accusing my employees of theft, that crosses a line." Before Sterling could respond, a knock at the door announced Thomas's arrival. The sous chef entered, holding the gleaming money clip. "Found it right under the chair." "Sir," he said, placing it on Marcus's desk. Sterling snatched it up, quickly thumbing through the bills inside, his face twisted with a mix of embarrassment and fury. "Well, it seems I was mistaken, but the way she's been hovering around our table all night—" "You mean doing her job?" Marcus stood slowly, and Sarah saw something in his eyes that surprised her. Not just anger, but recognition. "Tell me, Mr. Sterling, do you remember Carson Prep School, class of '98? The question seemed to hit Sterling like a physical blow. His face went completely white. What does that have to do with anything?" "Because I remember you. Maxwell Sterling III. I was the scholarship student who worked in the cafeteria to help pay for my books. The one you and your friends accused of stealing your Rolex, the watch that was later found in your gym locker." Sarah watched in astonishment as the dynamic in the room shifted dramatically. Sterling's arrogance crumbled, replaced by something that looked remarkably like fear. That was 25 years ago," Sterling stammered. "Yes, it was. And do you remember what happened after your false accusation? How the headmaster's son confessed that you'd planned the whole thing to get the charity case expelled?" How your father had to make a very generous donation to keep your name out of the official record. Sterling's hands were shaking now. You have no right to bring up ancient history. Ancient history has a way of repeating itself, Marcus said quietly. I worked 3 jobs to put myself through culinary school after Carson. Built this restaurant from nothing, and now I find you here, doing to my employee exactly what you did to me, trying to destroy someone's life to make yourself feel powerful. Sarah sat in stunned silence, watching the scene unfold. The pieces were falling into place. Marcus's immediate response to the accusation, his careful documentation of Sterling's behavior, the way he'd known exactly how to handle the situation. But Sterling wasn't finished. He stood up, straightening his jacket with trembling hands. You've made your point. I was mistaken about the money clip. But if you think you can blackmail me with ancient school stories— Blackmail? Marcus laughed. But there was no humor in it. No, Mr. Sterling, I'm not interested in blackmail. What I am interested in is justice. You see, Sarah here isn't just any waitress. Would you like to tell him who you were before the recession, Sarah? Before your husband's hedge fund collapsed? Sarah's throat went dry. She'd never told anyone at the restaurant about her past, about the life she'd had before David's fund went under, before he'd disappeared with what was left of their money, leaving her and Emily with nothing but debts and broken promises. Sterling turned to look at her, really look at her, for the first time all night. His eyes widened with dawning recognition. Sarah Kincaid? David Kincaid's wife? The name she'd left behind years ago hung in the air like smoke. Sarah lifted her chin, meeting Sterling's gaze. Yes, Mr. Sterling, though I prefer Mitchell now. My maiden name. What happened next would change everything, not just for Sarah and Sterling, but for the entire Boston financial community. Because Sarah had carried a secret of her own for 6 years, one that would turn Sterling's world upside down and force him to confront more than just his prejudices. Sterling's face had taken on an ashen quality as he stared at Sarah, recognition mixing with something that looked remarkably like fear. David Kincaid's wife, he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. But you disappeared after the scandal. After my husband stole millions from his investors and vanished? Sarah's voice was steady now, strengthened by 6 years of rebuilding her life from the ashes. After you and the other board members claimed you had no idea what was happening, even though you were signing off on every transaction. Marcus leaned back in his chair, his eyes moving between them. The security monitors cast a blue glow across his face as he watched the drama unfold. A drama he'd apparently been expecting since the moment Sterling first walked into his restaurant months ago. I have no idea what you're talking about, Sterling said quickly, too quickly. His hand went to his tie, adjusting it nervously. The investigation cleared the board completely. We were victims just like the other investors. Sarah reached into her work apron and pulled out a folded piece of paper, worn at the creases from years of safekeeping. You mean this investigation, Mr. Sterling? She smoothed the paper on Marcus's desk. The one where you testified under oath that you had no knowledge of the offshore accounts? Sterling's eyes fixed on the document, and what little color remained drained from his face. It was a copy of an email chain, dozens of messages between Sterling, David, and other board members, discussing the very accounts they'd later claimed to know nothing about. Where did you get that? Sterling's voice cracked. The night before David disappeared, he came home drunk, really drunk. He was rambling about how it was all falling apart, how he couldn't trust anyone anymore. He forwarded every incriminating email to my personal account before passing out. Sarah's hands were steady as she pointed to specific dates and transactions. 6 years I've kept this, wondering what to do with it. Wondering if coming forward would just hurt Emily and me more than we'd already been hurt. Marcus picked up the document, examining it closely. These dates, they correspond exactly with the major withdrawals that were never explained in the investigation. You can't prove any of this, Sterling said. But his bravado was crumbling. Those emails could be faked. No one would believe. The SEC would believe it, Sarah cut in, especially since I've kept the original email in my account, with all the digital signatures and routing information intact. I was a financial analyst before I married David. Remember, I know exactly how to verify electronic communications. Sterling collapsed back into his chair, his expensive suit suddenly looking like it was wearing him instead of the other way around. "What do you want?" he asked hoarsely. "Money? Is that what this is about? You set this whole thing up." "Set it up," Sarah laughed, and the sound held years of pain and anger. "You really think I orchestrated you accusing me of theft tonight? That I somehow knew you'd try to destroy another innocent person's life, just like you did to Marcus years ago, just like you did to all those investors? Then why?" Sterling's voice was small now. "Why work here all these months, serving drinks and food like someone beneath you?" Marcus supplied, his tone sharp. "That's always been your problem, Maxwell. You never could see the dignity in honest work." Sarah stood up, smoothing her apron with trembling hands. "I work here because it's honest work. Because every dollar I earn is clean. Because I'd rather serve meals to arrogant men like you than live off money stolen from people who trusted us with their life savings." She turned to Marcus, who was watching her with something like pride in his eyes. "I never planned to use those emails. I kept them as insurance, in case David ever came back trying to hurt Emily and me again. But seeing Mr. Sterling tonight, watching him try to destroy someone else's life just because he could," she shook her head. "Maybe it's time for the truth to come out." Sterling lunged forward, his composure completely shattered. "You can't. The statute of limitations hasn't expired," Marcus finished. "Not for fraud of this magnitude, and certainly not with new evidence proving perjury and conspiracy." "Please," Sterling whispered, and for the first time there were tears in his eyes. "I have a family, children." "So do I," Sarah said quietly. "A daughter who spent years thinking she wasn't good enough because her father abandoned her, who had to leave her private school and watch her friends turn their backs because of what you and David did." Marcus stood up, walking to his office door. Through the window, they could see the restaurant was still running smoothly, unaware of the drama unfolding behind closed doors. "Mr. Sterling," he said, "I think it's time we discussed how you're going to make this right. What happened next would reshape the lives of everyone in that room. A proposal that would offer Sterling a chance at redemption while ensuring justice for those who had been wronged. But first, Sarah would have to confront the hardest truth of all, that revenge, no matter how justified, comes with its own price." Marcus Chen's office had become an unlikely courtroom, with Sterling, the once proud hedge fund manager, sitting slumped in his chair like a man awaiting sentence. The security monitors continued their silent vigil, displaying the normal evening service continuing beyond the office walls, a stark contrast to the life-altering confrontation unfolding within. "Here's what's going to happen," Marcus said, returning to his desk with deliberate slowness. "You're going to make restitution, not just to the investors you helped defraud, but to every person whose life you've tried to destroy with your false accusations and prejudices." Sterling's head snapped up, a flash of his old defiance returning. "And if I refuse, if I deny everything and claim these emails are fabricated, my lawyers—" "Your lawyers," Sarah interrupted, "would be very interested in the metadata embedded in these emails. The digital signatures, the routing information, and let's not forget the offshore account numbers that only board members knew about." She leaned forward, her voice steady. "Numbers that match perfectly with accounts that were mysteriously emptied just days before David disappeared." A bead of sweat rolled down Sterling's temple. "You don't understand. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. David, he promised us it was foolproof, that everyone would make so much money nobody would ever look too closely at the numbers. And when it started falling apart," Marcus pressed, "when you realized people were going to lose everything, Sterling's facade cracked completely. We panicked. David said he had a plan, that he'd take the fall and protect the rest of us. We didn't know he was going to—" He looked at Sarah, real shame finally showing in his eyes. We didn't know he was going to abandon his family. That wasn't part of the plan. Sarah felt a cold knot in her stomach. So you let him take all the blame. You protected yourselves by pretending to be victims, by lying under oath, while my daughter and I lost everything. You have to understand, Sterling pleaded. We all had families to protect, reputations. If the truth came out, the truth, Marcus cut in sharply, is exactly what's going to come out now, unless... He pulled out a thick manila envelope from his desk drawer and placed it carefully on the polished surface between them. Unless you agree to my terms. Sterling stared at the envelope as if it might bite him. What terms? Marcus opened the envelope and began laying out documents one by one. First, you're going to establish a restitution fund, $50 million from your personal accounts. Don't bother claiming you don't have it. We both know about the shell company in the Caymans where you've been hiding your portion of the stolen money. Sarah's eyes widened. She hadn't known about this part of Marcus's plan. The fund will be administered by an independent board, Marcus continued, with priority given to the smaller investors who lost their life savings. People like Mrs. Henderson. The name hit Sterling like a physical blow. Mrs. Henderson? My old history teacher, Sarah explained, her voice thick with emotion. She invested her entire retirement fund with David because I told her she could trust him. She's working as a Walmart greeter now at 73 years old because she can't afford to retire. Sterling closed his eyes, the weight of real consequences finally seeming to settle on his shoulders. 50 million. It would nearly clean me out. How tragic, Marcus said dryly. You might have to live like a normal person instead of a king, but that's just the beginning. He laid out more documents. Second, you're going to confess. Not to the authorities, not yet, but to every member of your old board. You're going to tell them that Sarah has evidence, and you're going to convince them to contribute to the restitution fund as well. They'll never agree, Sterling protested weakly. They will when they realize the alternative is prison, Sarah said. The statute of limitations on fraud this large is 10 years. Add in the perjury charges, the conspiracy charges. How long do you think you'd last in prison, Mr. Sterling? The question hung in the air like smoke. Sterling's hands were shaking as he reached for the documents, scanning them with growing desperation. Third, Marcus continued relentlessly, you're going to use your connections to help Sarah rebuild her career in finance. Not as a favor, but because she's more qualified than half the people you work with. She's going to have a legitimate chance to rebuild her life, the life your conspiracy stole from her. Sarah started to protest. She hadn't asked for this, but Marcus held up a hand to silence her. And finally, he said, his voice taking on an edge that made even Sarah shiver, you're going to make a very public apology to everyone you've wronged with your baseless accusations over the years, starting with the busboy you got fired from the Capitol Grill last month by claiming he stole your cufflinks, the ones you later found in your car. Sterling's head snapped up. How did you... I've been watching you for months, Marcus said quietly, ever since I recognized you from Carson Prep. I've documented every false accusation, every attempt to harm people you consider beneath you. Did you really think it was coincidence that Sarah ended up serving your table tonight? The revelation hit Sarah like a thunderbolt. She turned to Marcus in shock. You knew all this time? Marcus nodded slowly. I recognized your name when you applied for the job. Did some research, found the connection to Sterling and David. I've been waiting for the right moment. Waiting to see if Sterling would show his true colors again. He smiled grimly. He didn't disappoint. Sterling was reading through the documents now, his face growing paler with each page. This is blackmail, he whispered. No, Marcus corrected. This is justice. Blackmail would be demanding money for ourselves. Everything in these documents goes to making things right for the people you've wronged. Think of it as your chance at redemption. Sarah watched as Sterling's shoulders slumped in defeat. The proud, arrogant man who had tried to have her arrested just hours ago was crumbling before her eyes. She should have felt triumphant, but instead she felt something unexpected. Pity. Why are you really doing this? She asked Marcus softly. Why go to all this trouble? Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his eyes distant, because 25 years ago, when Sterling and his friends accused me of theft at Carson Prep, someone believed in me. The school librarian. She found security footage that proved my innocence. She taught me that having power isn't about destroying people. It's about lifting them up when they've been knocked down. He turned to Sterling, his voice firm but not unkind. You have until morning to sign these documents and make the first transfer to the restitution fund. If you don't, he gestured to the emails Sarah had provided. These go to the SEC, the FBI, and every major news outlet in the country. Sterling picked up his pen with trembling fingers. And if I do sign, what guarantee do I have that you won't send them anyway? You have my word, Marcus said simply. The same word I gave when I promised myself I'd make something of my life after Carson Prep. The same word I gave Sarah when I hired her, promising she'd always have a job here if she needed it. As Sterling began to sign the documents, his hand shaking but his strokes deliberate, Sarah felt tears welling in her eyes. Not tears of triumph or revenge, but tears of release, as if a weight she'd carried for 6 years was finally lifting. But even as the papers were signed and the first steps toward justice were taken, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that the hardest part of her journey still lay ahead. Because tomorrow she would have to explain to her daughter Emily that sometimes justice comes in unexpected ways, and that the line between revenge and redemption is often thinner than we imagine. The restaurant beyond the office windows had grown quiet, the dinner service winding down. In just a few hours, the sun would rise on a new day, a day that would begin the process of healing wounds that had festered for far too long. But first, there were still decisions to be made, truths to be faced, and one final revelation that would test everything Sarah thought she knew about forgiveness. The dawn painted Boston's skyline in shades of gold and rose as Sarah Mitchell stood outside the Golden Fork, her uniform replaced by a simple black dress she hadn't worn in years. The morning air was crisp, carrying the promise of change and the weight of decisions yet to be made. Behind her, Marcus was locking up after their all-night meeting, while Sterling's expensive car had long since disappeared into the darkness, carrying its broken owner toward an uncertain future. "Are you ready for this?" Marcus asked softly, coming to stand beside her. Sarah took a deep breath, clutching her phone where Emily's text message still glowed. "Mom, where are you? Is everything okay?" She hadn't replied yet, knowing this wasn't something she could explain in a message. "No," she admitted, "but it needs to be done." The next 12 hours would reshape not just Sarah's life, but the lives of dozens of people touched by the fraud that had destroyed so many dreams 6 years ago. The carefully orchestrated plan that Marcus had set in motion was about to send ripples through Boston's financial community that no one could predict. The first stop was Sterling's office at the prestigious Morton and Sterling Investment Group. The building's marble lobby, once so intimidating to Sarah, now seemed like nothing more than an expensive facade, much like Sterling himself had been. They found him in his corner office, looking like he hadn't slept at all. His usual impeccable appearance was disheveled, his eyes red-rimmed and haunted. "They're all coming," he said without preamble. "The entire old board. I told them it was an emergency meeting about a potential SEC investigation." He laughed hollowly. "I suppose that wasn't even a lie." Within the hour, the boardroom began to fill with faces Sarah remembered from her past life. Men and women who had once attended her dinner parties, who had smiled and laughed with her while knowing they were helping to steal millions from their clients. Each face showed confusion at seeing her there, then shock as recognition set in. Sarah Kincaid. George Peterson, the former CFO, nearly dropped his coffee cup. "What is this, Maxwell?" Sterling stood at the head of the table, his hands trembling slightly as he gripped the back of his chair. "This is our day of reckoning, George. Sarah knows everything, has proof of everything, and we're going to make it right." What followed was 2 hours of denial, anger, threats, and finally, As the evidence mounted and the reality of their situation became clear, acceptance. Marcus watched it all with quiet authority, occasionally stepping in to redirect the conversation when tempers flared. Sarah found herself studying these people she had once known, seeing not the powerful financiers they pretended to be, but scared humans facing the consequences of their actions. The restitution fund is non-negotiable, Marcus explained, laying out copies of the documents Sterling had signed. Each of you will contribute proportionally to what you gained from the fraud. The alternative, he let the threat hang in the air, unspoken but clear. And David, Patricia Whitmore, the only woman on the old board, asked quietly. Has anyone heard from him? Sarah felt her heart clench at the mention of her ex-husband's name. No, she said firmly, and it doesn't matter. This isn't about David anymore. It's about making things right. As the board members began signing the documents, one by one, admitting their guilt and agreeing to the restitution plan, Sarah felt no triumph. Instead, she felt a profound sadness for all the lives that had been damaged by greed, including, she realized, the lives of these people who had lost their way. But the most difficult moment of the day was yet to come. That afternoon, Sarah sat in her small apartment, facing her daughter Emily across their worn kitchen table. At 16, Emily had her father's dark hair and Sarah's determination. But the past 6 years had forced her to grow up too quickly. So Dad, he wasn't the only one? Emily asked, her voice small but steady. All of them were in on it? Sarah reached across the table, taking her daughter's hand. Yes, but that's not the most important part of what I need to tell you. She explained everything. The emails she'd kept hidden, Marcus's careful plan, and the choice she now faced. As she spoke, she watched Emily's expressions shift from shock to anger to something deeper, more thoughtful. You could have exposed them years ago, Emily said finally. We wouldn't have had to struggle so much. Maybe, Sarah admitted, but I was afraid. Afraid of dragging you through another scandal, afraid of what David might do if he found out I had evidence. And maybe, she paused, the realization hitting her as she spoke, maybe I needed these years to understand what really matters. What do you mean? Sarah squeezed her daughter's hand. When we lost everything, I thought the worst part was losing our money, our status. But I was wrong. The worst part was losing our trust in people. Becoming bitter, angry. These past 6 years working at the restaurant, they taught me that there's dignity in honest work, in being part of something real. Emily's eyes filled with tears. But now we can get our old life back, right? With the restitution money. We could, Sarah said carefully. But I've been thinking, what if we did something different? She pulled out a folder, not the legal documents from earlier, but something else she and Marcus had discussed in the quiet hours of the morning. Marcus showed me that having power isn't about crushing people, it's about lifting them up. So I had an idea. The folder contained plans for a foundation, one that would not only distribute the restitution funds, but also provide education and support for people rebuilding their lives after financial fraud. Sarah explained her vision, using her financial expertise not to make the rich richer, but to help people understand and protect their investments. But what about Sterling and the others? Emily asked. After what they did to us, don't you want them to suffer? Sarah thought about Sterling's face in Marcus's office, about the hollow look in his eyes when he realized the cost of his actions. They are suffering, Emily. They're suffering because they finally have to face who they really are and what they've done. But making them suffer more won't heal us. What will heal us is creating something good from all this pain. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across their small kitchen, Sarah received a text from Marcus. It's done. All the documents are signed. The first transfers have been made. Emily read the message over her mother's shoulder. What happens now? Now, Sarah said, standing up and pulling her daughter into a hug. We start over, not by going backward to who we were, but by moving forward to who we want to be. Later that evening, Sarah returned to the Golden Fork. Not as a waitress this time, but as a guest. Marcus had insisted on treating her and Emily to dinner, their first meal in the main dining room, rather than grab between shifts in the kitchen. As they sat at a quiet corner table, Sarah looked around the restaurant with new eyes. She saw the other servers moving with the same grace and dignity she had learned, the customers enjoying their meals, the whole dance of service that she had been part of for 6 years. At a nearby table, she recognized Mrs. Henderson, her old history teacher, who Marcus had specially invited for the evening. "Mrs. Henderson," Sarah called softly, walking over to her former teacher, "I have something to tell you about your retirement fund." The joy and disbelief on the older woman's face as Sarah explained about the restitution fund was worth more than all the wealth she had lost. When Mrs. Henderson hugged her, crying tears of relief and gratitude, Sarah felt the last pieces of her old anger falling away. Marcus watched it all from the doorway of his kitchen, a small smile playing on his lips. He had known, somehow, that Sarah would choose this path, that given the chance for revenge, she would choose redemption instead. As the evening drew to a close, Sarah stood once more outside the Golden Fork, looking up at the stars barely visible through the city lights. Emily was beside her, holding her hand like she used to when she was little. Marcus joined them, carrying a bottle of champagne and 3 glasses. "To new beginnings," he proposed, pouring the champagne. "To justice," Emily added, holding up her glass. Sarah looked at them both, her daughter who had grown so strong, and the man who had shown her a different kind of power, and raised her own glass. "To dignity," she said softly, "and to all the ways we find our way back to who we're meant to be." The next morning, Sarah would begin the work of setting up the foundation. Sterling and the other board members would start making their amends, not just with money, but with actions that would slowly rebuild their humanity. And somewhere out there, David might hear about what had happened, about how his wife had chosen to turn their tragedy into something meaningful. But for now, standing in the cool evening air with the 2 people who had helped her find her way back to herself, Sarah Mitchell was exactly where she needed to be. She had learned that true power lies not in wealth or status, but in the ability to rise above bitterness and create something beautiful from the ashes of loss. The Golden Fork's lights dimmed behind them, but ahead the future glowed with possibilities. And Sarah knew that sometimes the longest journey isn't the one that takes you back to where you were, but the one that leads you to where you should have been all along. What would you have done in Sarah's position? Sometimes the line between justice and revenge becomes blurred when we're hurt deeply. Share your thoughts in the comments. Would you have chosen redemption, or would you have exposed everything immediately? And here's another question to consider. Have you ever experienced a moment where someone's kindness, like Marcus's, completely changed the direction of your life? Tell us about it below. If this story touched your heart and made you think, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe. Trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. Speaking of which, see that video on your left? Those unexpected twists, emotional revelations, and powerful moments of transformation you just experienced. They're waiting for you there too. Click it. You'll be glad you did. Remember, sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones that remind us of our own humanity. See you in the comments.